They say love doesn't always arrive like a fairy tale. Sometimes it shows up dressed in a tailored suit, armed with a contract and wrapped in conditions. For Catherine Hayes, love didn't come with flowers. It came with a job description. Catherine was the kind of woman who made things run without asking for praise. Her mornings began before the city's skyline turned gold, and her nights often ended staring at spreadsheets. A secretary by title, but a problem solver by instinct, she worked for Alexander Thornfield, a man known less for smiles and more for silence. Alexander wasn't cruel, but he wasn't warm either. He didn't believe in office birthday cakes or idle hallway chatter. He ran his billion-dollar empire with the precision of a chess grandmaster and the emotional availability of a brick wall. To most people, he was intimidating. But to Catherine, he was just her boss, complicated, unreadable, but manageable. At least until one morning when he shattered the routine with a single sentence. "I want you to pretend to be my girlfriend. No warning, no explanation. Just that." Catherine stared at him, assuming he was joking. But Alexander didn't joke. Ever. It turned out he was under pressure from his family, particularly his overbearing parents, to settle down and marry a suitable woman from another influential family. The kind of merger disguised as a marriage. He had no interest in this arrangement, but refusing outright came with consequences. So he crafted a workaround. If he showed up with a girlfriend, someone real and believable, the pressure would subside. At least for a while. And who better to fill the role than the woman who already handled everything else in his life? At first, Catherine said no, not because she wasn't tempted. He offered double her salary and total discretion, but because she didn't want to become another person, bending to the Thornfield family's whims. But reality is rarely so noble. Her younger brother had just been accepted into a prestigious university overseas. The tuition was a mountain she couldn't climb with her current paycheck. Sometimes dignity takes a back seat to responsibility, so she said yes. But she made rules. This was a job, nothing more. She'd play the part, attend the events, smile for the press, and keep her emotions locked away. The first test came sooner than expected. A formal charity gala hosted by Alexander's family, the kind of gathering where champagne flowed freely, but trust was rare. Catherine was dressed in a floor-length velvet gown, the color of garnet, her makeup done by professionals, who made her look like someone else entirely. As she stood before the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. It wasn't insecurity. It was dissonance. The strange realization that she was stepping into a role she'd never auditioned for, one she still wasn't sure she could play. When Alexander arrived to escort her, he said nothing at first, just a long, deliberate gaze. Finally, he muttered, "Not bad." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Try that again, but this time pretend you actually mean it." He almost smirked. Almost. The ballroom was stunning, chandeliers dripping with crystals, orchestras playing violins, and women floating across marble floors in designer gowns. And when they entered, every eye turned, not because of Alexander, but because of her. Catherine felt their stares, some curious, some judgmental, others downright hostile. She kept her chin up. This was part of the contract. They mingled, laughed on cue-clinked glasses. Catherine played her role flawlessly. But then it happened. Across the room stood a woman in white. Statuesque, blonde, her eyes locked on Alexander with something fierce and familiar. And Alexander froze. Catherine noticed his fingers tighten slightly around hers, subtle but unmistakable. "Who is she?" she whispered. He didn't answer. Not yet. Not until the woman approached. "Alex," the woman said, her voice silk over steel. "Eleanor Alexander," replied, and Catherine suddenly knew everything she needed to. This wasn't just a former flame, this was the one that burned him. Eleanor looked Catherine over with a tight smile. "So, this is new." Alexander didn't flinch. "This is Catherine, my girlfriend." That one sentence hit Catherine harder than she expected. It was just words, part of the act, but it landed with weight. Eleanor tilted her head, her smile hollow. "Really?" "You move on fast." Tension thickened like fog. And then, in a moment that Catherine hadn't rehearsed or anticipated, Alexander leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a polite peck. It wasn't strategic. It was intimate. Her breath caught. The world slowed. And despite every mental reminder that this was pretend, her heart had other ideas. What Catherine didn't know, what none of them admitted, was that in trying to fake a relationship, they had accidentally created something real. Maybe not love, not yet. But the seed was there, buried under fear, pride, and obligation. Later that night in the car ride back, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it was charged. Catherine stared out the window, wondering if she should address the kiss. Alexander, hands folded, looked straight ahead, like a man solving an impossible equation. Was he acting? Or did that kiss mean something she didn't ask? And he didn't explain. But pretending was already getting harder. At this point, a lot of people might ask, why didn't she quit? Why not walk away before things got messier? Because the truth is, we don't always walk away from what we know is dangerous. Sometimes we lean in because something about that danger also feels like hope. Catherine told herself she was still in control, that the contract would end in 3 months, and she would cash her check and return to normal life. But normal was already out of reach. The days that followed the gala were quiet. On the surface, everything returned to routine. Catherine resumed her responsibilities with clinical precision, and Alexander kept his words, clipped and businesslike. But something had shifted, and they both felt it, though neither admitted it aloud. It started with the small things. Alexander, who never lingered in conversation, began asking how her morning was. Not out of politeness, but with genuine curiosity. He brought her coffee once, not the brand she usually drank, but the fact that he tried it all was disarming. For Catherine, this wasn't just about awkward kisses or public charades anymore. She began noticing the moments between the moments, like the way he looked at her when she wasn't speaking, or the fact that he started saying her name differently, slower, softer, like it mattered. The most confusing part. These shifts didn't only happen in public. In front of cameras, sure, he kept up appearances, his hand on her waist, his body language protective. But when they were alone, those habits stayed. There was no press, no family. And yet, he still reached for her hand, still leaned in closer than necessary. She tried to convince herself it was all rehearsal, that maybe Alexander was just that thorough, the kind of man who didn't know how to do something halfway. But late at night when she was brushing her teeth or laying in bed alone, that theory didn't comfort her. It haunted her. And then Eleanor returned. Subscribe our channel for more powerful stories about love, self-growth, and human connection. And turn on the bell so you don't miss the next emotional journey. One late afternoon, as Catherine was organizing files in the office, the door burst open. not knocked, burst. Eleanor stood in the frame like she owned the air around her, her heels clicking with fury. "Alex, we need to talk." Her tone was sharp, her energy unmistakable. Catherine stiffened, her eyes flickering toward Alexander, who remained seated, cool, unreadable. "There's nothing left to discuss," he said. "Oh, please," Eleanor scoffed. "Do you honestly expect me to believe that you're in love with her?" Catherine's breath caught. She wasn't prepared for this. Eleanor stepped further in her gaze, narrowing on Catherine. "You're his secretary. He doesn't do love, he does control. This," she gestured at Catherine's carefully curated appearance, "this is all part of the performance." Alexander finally stood, voice low. "Eleanor, that's enough." She didn't flinch. "Then prove me wrong. If you're really in love with her, kiss her. Right here. Right now." Catherine's stomach dropped. She hadn't signed up for this kind of confrontation. Her heart thundered like war drums. This wasn't a staged event or a cocktail party, this was a challenge. One that could shatter everything. Alexander didn't hesitate. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, wrapped an arm around Catherine's waist, and kissed her again. But this kiss was different. There was no audience, no clinking glasses, no ballroom glamour, just heat and tension, and something that felt far too real. Catherine froze. Her hands trembled slightly as they touched the front of his shirt, unsure whether to push him away or pull him closer. His touch was firm but not forceful. His lips, warm and slow, said what his words never had. When he finally pulled back, silence filled the room. Even Eleanor didn't have a response. Her mouth opened, then closed again, her eyes glassy with something that looked a lot like regret. She left without another word, and in that stillness, Catherine finally spoke. "You didn't have to do that." Alexander's response was barely a whisper. "I don't like being doubted." But his eyes betrayed him. They weren't defensive. They were searching, scared even. Like he wasn't sure if what he'd just done was brave or foolish. That night, Catherine didn't sleep. She lay awake, replaying everything from the contract to the kiss to the look in his eyes when Eleanor left. What were they doing? Where did the act end and the truth begin? Could she even tell anymore? The next week was filled with more appearances, press interviews, charity luncheons, high society brunches. Each one played out like clockwork. But every moment, Alexander touched her hand or looked at her with something that resembled affection. Catherine's resolve unraveled. She knew it wasn't sustainable. So at one of the company's evening events, a rooftop launch party overlooking the skyline, she pulled him aside, away from the flashbulbs, away from the curious stares, just the two of them and the wind. "Alex," she said, voice trembling slightly, "we need to stop this." He frowned. "Stop what?" "This," she said, gesturing between them. "The act. I can't do it anymore." His posture stiffened. "Has someone said something?" "No," she whispered. "It's me. I can't pretend anymore. Because I think I've fallen for you. And if this is still just business to you, I can't keep hurting myself by pretending it's not." Alexander's face didn't move. For a second she thought he might walk away, that he'd offer a cool apology and explain why professionalism needed to be restored. But then he did something unexpected. He laughed quietly. Not mockingly, but in disbelief. "You think you're the only one confused," he said, voice suddenly rougher, softer. "You think I planned for this to happen?" He took a step closer. "I planned the contract. I planned the dinners. I planned the performances, but what I didn't plan," his voice broke slightly, "was falling in love with you." Catherine's breath caught. He continued, "I told myself I was just protecting my company, that this was just a means to an end. But every time you walked into a room, every time you stood beside me, and didn't flinch, every time you told me the truth, even when I didn't want to hear it, I fell a little more. I love you, Catherine." The words felt raw, real, unscripted. She didn't respond right away. Tears welled in her eyes, and her heart pulsed so loud she could barely hear the city around her. She stepped closer and rested her forehead against his chest. "I don't want a contract," she whispered. "I just want you. No more pretending. No more performance." 1 year later, the world looked completely different, not because it had changed, but because Catherine had. She stood at the edge of a sunlit garden, dressed in a white gown that shimmered with soft satin and quiet promise. Every step she took down the aisle felt like the final chapter in a book she never thought she'd write. The guests turned. The breeze lifted her veil. And at the far end, beneath a blooming arbor of ivory roses, stood Alexander Thornfield, once a ruthless CEO, now a man with something far more fragile in his grasp: love. But let's rewind, because not all love stories end in white dresses. Some of them nearly fall apart before they're stitched together. After the rooftop confession, after Alexander finally told Catherine the truth, their relationship didn't magically become perfect. There were walls to dismantle, habits to unlearn, wounds to understand. Alexander was still the man who didn't trust easily, and Catherine was still the woman afraid of being just another chapter in someone else's book. For weeks they kept things quiet. No announcements, no press releases, just long, real conversations. They talked without pretending, without positioning, without playing roles. One evening, Catherine finally asked the question that had haunted her for months. "Why me?" Alexander looked at her, serious as ever. "Because you were the only one who didn't try to impress me. You just were you." And that perhaps was the most romantic thing he'd ever said, not because it was poetic, but because it was honest. See, real love doesn't come from grand gestures or fireworks. It's built in the quiet, in the decision to stay when leaving would be easier, in the choice to believe day after day that someone is worth your truth. There was no more contract, no deadlines, no pretending. But even as they grew closer, the past occasionally reached out, reminding them of who they used to be. Eleanor called once, not to threaten or accuse, just to say goodbye. A genuine goodbye this time. "I used to think he was incapable of love," she told Catherine over the phone. "Turns out he was just waiting for someone to challenge him, to see through him." Catherine didn't gloat. She just said he was worth the wait. And he was. When Alexander proposed, he didn't do it with flash mobs or diamond-studded fountains. He did it in the quiet of his office, the very place where their story had begun. She was organizing files. He walked over, nervous in a way she'd never seen. "I don't have a speech," he said, "and I don't have a perfect plan. But I know one thing: I've spent too much of my life avoiding risk. And the biggest risk I almost took was losing you." He held out a ring. "Marry me. Not because it's expected, but because we finally stopped pretending." She didn't cry, not right away. She just nodded. "Yes," she whispered, "but you still have to make your own coffee from now on." Their wedding wasn't lavish, but it was personal. Every flower had meaning. Every guest knew the truth. There was no performance, just presence. And as Catherine reached Alexander beneath the arbor, he took her hand with the steadiness of someone who no longer needed control to feel powerful. "You look like trouble," he teased quietly. "And you look like someone who finally figured out what matters," she replied. The officiant spoke, but Catherine barely heard the words. All she could focus on was the way Alexander looked at her, not with possession or calculation, but with something infinitely more rare in his eyes: peace. When the vows were exchanged, they didn't promise perfection. They promised effort, growth, patience, truth. And when Alexander whispered, "I love you," in her ear, it wasn't to impress anyone. It was for her, only her. After the ceremony, as the sun dipped below the trees and music drifted through the air, Alexander pulled her aside. "Do you regret anything?" he asked. Catherine thought for a moment. "Only that we spent so long pretending." That's the irony of love stories born from deception. They often teach us more about honesty than any conventional romance ever could. Catherine and Alexander didn't fall in love through fate or magic. They fell in love through resistance, through circumstance, through slow unraveling. And maybe that's why their story matters. Because we're taught to believe that love should arrive with certainty. But more often than not, it arrives messy, inconvenient, and utterly unplanned. It sneaks in between the cracks of obligation and logic-defying rules we thought we needed. Love doesn't always knock on the door politely. Sometimes it barges in like Eleanor did, demanding proof, forcing clarity. And other times, it waits quietly in coffee cups, in late-night conversations, in the choice to stay vulnerable when you want to retreat. Catherine's journey wasn't about becoming someone else's dream girl. It was about becoming someone who could finally receive love without needing to earn it through sacrifice. And Alexander's arc wasn't about transformation into some romantic ideal. It was about letting go of armor, about learning that power isn't in dominance, but in softness, in choosing to be known. So if there's a lesson here, one worth carrying beyond the end credits, it's this: sometimes the most honest love begins in the most dishonest place, not because it was meant to, but because two people who never meant to fall did. And once they did, they chose not to run, but to stay, to try, to grow. Maybe love doesn't always come when we want it, but it shows up when we're ready to stop pretending. And that's when everything finally becomes real. Thanks for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, made you think, or just gave you hope, consider sharing it with someone who might need it today. And remember, the best stories don't always start with love. They start with a moment of courage. Subscribe our channel for more powerful stories about love, self-growth, and human connection, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next emotional journey.